Good evening to you. It's good to be with you again tonight as we look at the book of Hebrews. An exciting book to look at in God's Word. The first book that I studied in any kind of a college situation was the book of Hebrews. And the West Kentucky School of Bible Knowledge was affiliated with Freed-Hardeman College. Many years ago, I took the book of Hebrews. I think it's one of the books that I've enjoyed. It really was a hard book to start the first book of a deep study in, but it's one that really set my mind to studying. Because I believe in the book of Hebrews, we see the promises of the Old Testament and the promises of the New Testament and how they are shown to be basically the same promise, the promise for salvation for mankind. In this one, we start here in chapter 6, verse 13, the beginning of this paragraph. It says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could not swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, Surely blessing I will bless you, and multiply I will multiply you. And so, after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise." We look at this, and he's talking about the promise, I believe, the land promise that he was to inherit. He was promised basically he was going to be a great family, a great multitude. He was going to become such a great family. He was promised that he would become a great nation, and that they would basically inherit the land of Canaan from where he could see from the top of the mountain one direction to the other, what we call Palestine today. He was promised that. And then, of course, he was promised that through his seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. But, there's one thing as I look at this. It says, and so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. Which one? When he died, he didn't have but a very small family behind him. He didn't own any land. The only land that he ever owned was a plot in the cemetery where his wife and himself was buried. That's all the land he owned in his life or at his death. His children, just a few years later, only amounted to about 77 when his son and grandsons went down into Egypt. But what did it mean? He patiently endured till he obtained a promise. First thing, he obtained a promise because Abraham is like every human being, have an everlasting soul. It was a promise that he was able to have, and it was fulfilled to him after he was gone. We see Jesus talk about the parable or the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and it talks about Abraham's bosom. The Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom, showing that Abraham was even active, even around after death, he was still present. We have a present, and I firmly believe that all of us has a present, even after we leave this body. We don't go to the dust as the animal, Ecclesiastes says, but our spirit goes back to God who gave it. And the way we live determines what God does with it. If he keeps it, or he sends it someplace else. And I see that Abraham, according to that, it says there, he was there in paradise. He was there. We need to realize, but he was able to receive that promise. Now, he received that promise. He received that promise because of what he did. He did something. And let's read on, and then I'm going to come back to finish a little bit about this thought. Let's go on and read there, 16 beginning. It says, for man indeed swears by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. That is, they would, make an oath. They would make an oath, when we was kids. You heard on my mama's grave and all that. But the Jews would say oath on Jerusalem, or oath on the temple. When they did that, that was saying they was going to, if they didn't keep the word, they were going to go to hell, basically, is what they were saying. But says, but this God demanded to show more abundantly to his heirs of the promise, immutable. That is, without any consent of being wrong of his counsel, he confirmed it by an oath. God confirmed it by an oath. And there's two immutable things that cannot be changed. It says, when it is, and these are, one, it is impossible for God to lie. It is impossible for God to lie. We might have strong consolation who have fared for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. There's going to be people try to lay hold of the hope and say it's not going to happen. There was people tried to stop Abraham. There was people tried to kill Abraham. But God always was there. It says, verse 19, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entered the presence behind the veil. They're talking about behind the veil was in the temple. Behind the veil in the temple represented the presence of God. We have something behind the veil, that is in the presence of God. It says, verse 20, where the forerunners has entered for us, even Jesus entered into the presence of God. He ascended to be at the right hand of the throne of God. It says, having become a high priest. Jesus is a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the king and blessed him. Now, we could go on next week and look at this, but this shows us a little bit about what he is talking about. In the sense, the promise was made. The promise was made if we look back in Genesis. We look back in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 16. Starting there in about 15 and 15, the promise was, he said, now, I'm going to give you all of this land. That's what he said. But then in 16, he says, giving you this land in 400 years, not now, because the sins of the Amorites are not yet full. He said, well, I'm going to give it to you, same as yours, but in 400 years. Now, he trusted in God that God would give it to him 400 years later. Not to him in the sense, but to him because of his. Now, how did he know this, and how had he proven his trust in God? Well, the same way that he ended this verse, he said, Jesus has went into the presence of God, became the priest as the order of Melchizedek. Before this promise was made in this verse that we look at it in 15 and 16, we can look and see that in Genesis 14, we see that God was with Abraham and his troops as they went and got his nephew back. A few defeated many, and he went back, and he came up and he saw somebody there in Salem. It was the priest of the Most High God. Abraham was called to be special, but he wasn't beyond God or even the priest of God, because it says he came to him and he gave him a tenth, a tithe, according to, he gave him basically God's share of what God had done. He gave it to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God. Isn't it something that after that priest gave the blessing, that after that, then God made the promise to Abraham? The next chapter, what did he say? The next chapter, he said, you are going to receive this land. When? In 400 years. You're going to receive this land. So it was, and a lot of people, maybe I don't think I'm seeing too much in this. I'm seeing a man that worshiped God and recognized his priest, the priest of God. And then after he's recognizing the priest of God and worshiping God the way that God wanted him to, or God wouldn't have made him the priest, and he knew he was the priest of the Most High God. Matter of fact, we even said one of the reasons that he didn't get that land at that generation was, it said, because the sins of the Amorites was not yet full. We can see that because there was a king and a priest there in Salem who was a priest of God. You know, if he was a priest of God, it kind of take for granted there was somebody else there worshiping. He had to be the priest of somebody beside that was coming to him. There were still a few. I don't know the exact number, but I know there were some that were still worshiping God at that time. I don't know why we sometimes think that Abraham was the only person that worshiped God in the time of his life. The Bible just showed that that's not the case. But he was the one chosen. We don't have the list of people. Now, even the time of Noah, I mean, not Noah, but time of Moses, we can see that his father-in-law was a priest of God, even gave him some advice, and he listened to it. So even some 400 years later, there was still a people that worship God. But the thing about it is, they was not God's people of the promise. And we got to remember that. They was God's people of the promise. And that promise was a family, was a nation, but also the promise that through his seed, not seed as many, but seed as the one, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. The rest we're going to study next week and start and seeing the high priest that we have, that seed that we have that came, and how we today can inherit a promised place much greater than Palestine. God be with you till we meet again.